My partner and I are proud to negate. Our first contention is pandemics. U.S. great power competition ruins cooperation with China, which kills future pandemic preparedness. Gillette 20 confirms that 17 years ago, coronavirus emerged in China, but back then, a fruitful partnership emerged between the U.S. and China, contributing greatly to the success of the outbreak. Today, China and the U.S. have engaged in all-out confrontation. From great power competition, the U.S. reduces alignments of the Chinese and U.S. science and technology. The U.S. and China have engaged entangled science in their strategic competition, and COVID-19 was the first disaster in a series of global tragedies that will fall upon humanity if the two major scientific actors fail to collaborate. This is because great power competition kills funding and prevents China cooperation. 921 found that America can't tackle pandemics by itself. Addressing these global problems will require the U.S. to work with China, and Sullivan 22 corroborates. There needs to be in place global health intelligence systems that work, and Evans 20 furthers that international cooperation between China and the USA is essential to fully engage the resources and scientific strengths to pandemic preparedness. Concerningly, the next pandemic will come from factory farms and will be far worse. According to Jones 20, overcrowded farms could trigger the next pandemic, 100 times worse when it comes, with a fatality rate of 1 in 2. It is crucial to cooperate with China and stop the next pandemic. Our second contention is Iran. Wall 21 found that the Pentagon's new 2+3 framework for GPC grades Russia and China as the primary threats, while framing North Korea, Iran, and terrorism as secondary threats. This has the potential to oversimplify the most complex challenges faced by the U.S. In an era of great power competition, according to Edelman 18, the National Defense Strategy suggests that the U.S. must be prepared to take risks in the Middle East as it reorients effort on Europe and East Asia. Withdrawal of American power from the Middle East will create a vacuum that will be filled by both Russia and Iran. This will intensify security competitions that destabilize the region and create an ongoing threat to Israel's security. Chiua 21 finds that Iran is more emboldened, willing to take risks, and appears less restrained by American military power. And despite the fiasco, the Biden administration's desire for a regional drawdown continues, and this is because of the new GPC framework. Lapin 22 furthers that surveys of the Israeli public show confidence in the White House has fallen significantly since the Trump administration. Biden has released Iran to undermine Israel, and unlike the 81 and 07 strikes, Israel currently faces a more difficult security predicament. The Islamic Republic of Iran has proxies wrapped around Israel like a snake. Lebanon's Hezbollah and Gaza's Hamas. Jerusalem is not content to just mow the grass and strategically limit strikes, but it is preparing to get rid of the entire yard. Should Israel strike Iran, it would bring about the worst war the Middle East has ever seen, and the table is set for catastrophe. Means 21 reports that nuclear war's potential hasn't been so high in 80 years. U.S. weakness and lack of capability could lead to a huge aggressive military miscalculations. Iran, Pakistan, North Korea, and Israel, who have all been downgraded as threats by great power competition, have a full nuclear triad, and the world is a powder keg. Our third contention is lethal autonomous weapons. Great power competition has led to an American emphasis on AI and autonomous lethal weapons. CRS 22 finds that the renewal of great power competition has led to a renewed emphasis in U.S. defense on high-end, technologically sophisticated military capabilities. Officials express concern that U.S. superiority has narrowed by China, and in response, new increased funding for artificial intelligence and automated unmanned weapons have increased. America is already deploying autonomous weapons near China, and GPC prevents them from stopping. Bartlett 19 found the Pentagon has committed $9 billion to spend on American military AI, explicitly citing the need to keep up with Russian and Chinese military technology. And they've already started deploying autonomous vehicles in turbulent areas and begun to patrol the South China Sea. Great power competition rushes the implementation of these weapons and leads to war. Instead, cooperation is needed. Vincent 19 finds experts are worried that a rush to integrate AI into weapons could accidentally lead to war because they see an arms race dynamic. Cyber warfare will intrude in ways they wouldn't if humans were involved, and any autonomous conflict is catastrophic. Aguirre Training finds that an arms race in AWSs dramatically increases the risk of accidental triggering of conflict because they react in unpredictable ways. Escalation would be a global power nuclear war, but U.S.-China cooperation would solve, according to Carson 19. GBC is taking us in the wrong direction. For these reasons, I strongly open it. Thank you.
We affirm contention 1 is naval security. Subpoint A is underwater cables. Jones 22 states that 90% of all data in the world flows through undersea cables lining the ocean floor. The Indo-Pacific Defense Forum 22 states that the undersea cable industry has become one of the latest realms of great power competition between the US and China. Fortunately, this has bolstered development. The IPDF continues that as part of great power competition, the US must offer better alternatives to Chinese infrastructure, creating a positive cycle of development. Indeed, Barrett 21 states US funding has already been provided to Micronesia due to competition with a formally proposed Chinese plan. Furthermore, the US has already announced the Clean Network program to safeguard critical data and increase cybersecurity as part of great power competition with China. Overall, GPC has been critical for sea cable innovation and development, as states' undersea cables represent one of the newest and most sensitive fronts in the rivalry between China and the US in the strategic waters of the Pacific. The impact is economic growth, as roughly $10 trillion in financial transactions are transmitted via these cables each day. They've become a critical part of our global economy. Modern fiber optic cables are the lifeblood of the world's economy, carrying almost 100% of global internet communication. O'Connor states that cables are the global internet backbone, connecting countries, carrying communications, and enabling commerce and education, increasing job creation by 8% and GDP by 19%. This is critical, as The Economist 13 finds that every 1% increase in GDP reduces poverty by around 1.7%. Subpoint B is South China Sea. Chowdhury 21 writes that tensions in the South China Sea are ramping up due to China's continued military aggression and desire to keep a stronghold on the sea for trade purposes. Indeed, James 22 finds, as part of the GPC, the South China Sea is one of the key theaters of clash between the US and China. And in order to maintain our hold, we must continue to maintain a strong posture. Luckily, the Great Power Competition, or GPC strategy, is key. Hink 21 writes that the GPC strategy pushes the US further than before in combining cyber and precision strikes on China's key economic and informational capabilities. Indeed, Nakamura 21 writes that just last year, the US began a $27 billion initiative to establish a network of precision strike missiles along islands in the Indo-Pacific theater, marking the start of the US heightened conventional deterrence in the region. Jacobs 15 analyzes that China views appeasement as weakness, creating a sense among Chinese leaders that they can expand without protest. This leads to Cato 17 furthering that if China feels their leverage and control has grown, they will push for a decisive win in the South China Sea. Consequently, tensions in the region force ships to take longer routes and destroys investor confidence, which spikes the price of oil and thus the price of food, and that means that 44 million people were pushed into extreme poverty and famine. Contention 2 is African investment. While COVID has shaken the global economy and spooked many investors due to uncertainty, contrarily, Chinese investment in Africa has been climbing. IISD 21 writes that China invested $3 billion in Africa last year and has been their largest trading partner for 12 years. Sun 18 explains that under Xi, China has grown increasingly interested in portraying Africa as a strong supporter and a living testament of China's great power status. Indeed, great power competition has been beneficial in two ways. First is improving norms. Childs 20 finds that competition between China and the West will force both to comply with better norms in terms of allocation of money for NGOs, nonprofits, etc. And Sol 22 finds that African governments would greatly benefit from such partnership diversification and having China and the US compete for contracts. Second is increasing investment. Sign 21 writes that having more competitors in the game leads to accelerated trade and investment in Africa, creating booming potential. Trade in and with Africa has grown 300% in the last couple of years, almost doubling the global average. Indeed, overall, Platt 17 writes that global economic integration in Africa creates a ripple effect, breaking poverty cycles and ensuring stability. This would also grow the economy, as Taha 17 confirms that a 1% increase in infrastructure decreases poverty by 4.5%. That's why we affirm.
Okay. May I have the first question since we spoke first?
Sure.
All right. So I understand how like undersea cables are beneficial to the economy, right? But is there a specific truth that increasing the amount of these undersea cables is actually beneficial and that this would only happen with GPC?
It's not. I don't think that's not the essence of our argument. The essence of our argument is that we're safeguarding these sorts of cables and we're also like innovating them. So we're like making them like better and faster. So it's not necessarily making more of them. It's just improving them. It's like the same thing as like
Is there a threat to
technological
them right now?
innovation.
So you say
Sorry.
safeguarding them, right? Is there a threat to them right now? Did you read evidence that, like, was
Well,
that part of your contention that there's like, currently a threat to them?
Well, it's safeguarding critical data. It's not necessarily that they're a threat, but we always have cybersecurity in order to safeguard data from, like, for example, like non-state actors and stuff. So that's always a beneficial thing to have.
All right, sounds good.
Okay.
So
Can I ask you a
can I ask a
question?
follow-up real quick? Can I ask a follow-up? So
Sure.
okay. You're saying that these cables are beneficial, right? But in your South China Sea argument, aren't you saying that we need to do cyber strikes on China? Wouldn't this like reverse the growth you're talking about?
These are completely in two completely different arenas, like technological innovation and making sure that we're establishing deterrence in South China Sea are like very like mutually exclusive. So can I ask you a question?
Sure.
In terms of like the China outbreak that you talk about, like how much did it spread in terms of the 17 years ago outbreak?
Yeah, well, what we'd argue is that it didn't spread that much, and that's because the U.S. and
Exactly,
China were
because
able to. No. May I finish? You asked me a question. May I
sure,
finish
sure.
responding? Okay. What I'm arguing is the pandemic 17 years ago, the reason it didn't spread is because we were actually able to cooperate with China, right? We're able to share information, share science, and we're interconnected enough that we were able to control the spread of the pandemic. On the other
It's
hand,
really correlation. Can I
nowadays with the
quickly
COVID pandemic, we didn't share any information. China kept it hidden from us. Guess what? It spread across the world.
Okay, I would say A, on the 17 years ago pandemic, it literally did not leave China, which means that you do not need any sort of cooperation between US and China. China handled it, and that's why it was such a much better response. But then B, there's been so much like vaccine cooperation, there's so much like scientific cooperation because military and scientific cooperation are very different. Like
No.
scientists can still cooperate despite any sort of like military tensions. And so these
Okay.
are very like different. But you can
Okay.
ask a
So
question.
no, I'm gonna respond again to this. So
Okay.
military cooperation, our evidence shows that China and the US are getting this military strategy involved in their cooperation, and it's leading to a lack of cooperation. What we'd argue is there was no vaccine cooperation whatsoever with the US and China, right? We use completely different vaccines. The US created the Pfizer vaccine, and China created the relatively ineffective Sinovac vaccine, right?
Okay, well, if you want to,
Let me finish, please. There was no cooperation there whatsoever, and that's the reason that the pandemic was able to spread outside China. The entire reason it didn't spread outside China is because China cared about the other countries and cooperated with the other countries to make sure the flights didn't spread, the boats didn't spread,
okay,
the
we'll
planes didn't spread,
contest
and the
that, but
airplanes
also
didn't spread.
healthy
But,
competition also leads to more innovation. So that would also turn your argument. But I think time's up.
okay.
Time. Oh yeah, everyone's ready. Time starts now. Go to their first contention, and first of all, on their subpoint A about these undersea cables, a couple problems here. First, we would argue that the innovation they are talking about happens regardless. That's because there's an independent incentive for the world to upgrade their security absent great power competition. Our opponents have to isolate these benefits solely to great power competition, or they have to prove a significant advantage that only comes with great power competition. And insofar as we would argue this protection happens regardless, they get absolutely no offense here insofar it has nothing to do with great power competition. But then secondly, we would argue that this argument acts as a contradiction to the one they read next. That's because they are A, advocating for protecting the global security order, but then in the next subpoint they read you, they are talking about attacking China with cybersecurity weapons, which is obviously a contradiction. They can't have it in both. They can't have both worlds. But then go to their actual impact evidence. It's absolutely terrible. The O'Connor evidence they sent us is talking about an increase in the DRC. It has absolutely nothing to do with great power competition. It has absolutely nothing to do with the South China Sea. It has absolutely nothing to do with the investments they talk about in Micronesia. With that being said, let's go to their next argument about the South China Sea. A couple responses. We would argue that China always has an independent incentive to attack, because China would have an incentive to take over the South China Sea regardless of great power competition. However, our opponents are the ones who are starting the game of escalation and militarization. By their own argument, they're literally militarizing the South China Sea. We can no longer cooperate militarily by their own argument, as Palmer 22 explains, that Beijing canceled US-China military discussions after Pelosi's visit and after the United States is ramping up the militarization and doing exactly what our opponents are advocating for through great power competition. But then again, their argument here, in their case, they tell you that the United States is increasing the amount of cyber strikes, or at least the cyber strike capabilities against China, which is again a absolute contradiction to their previous argument about trying to enhance the global security order through these cyber cables. But then read their actual evidence. It's absolutely terrible again. They tell you that 44 million people have gone into poverty. There's a ton of problems here. A, it has nothing to do with the South China Sea, the argument they are talking about. B, it has absolutely nothing to do with great power competition. But then C, it's a holistic thing about the entire developing world. Again, it has absolutely nothing to do with great power competition. But let's go to their next contention. Let's go to their next contention about Africa. First, let's go to the next contention about Africa. First, we would tell you that what our opponents are advocating for is an imperialist society where our opponents are just trying to debt trap Africa and use them for all their resources. That's because our opponents need to prove to you that they fundamentally care, that our opponents need to prove to you that the United States fundamentally cares about Africa and their well-being, which they absolutely don't. The United States is just trying to compete with China, the great power competition. They're just trying to compete with China, and they're going to use up all of Africa's resources. They praise the Belt and Road Initiative and great power influence over Africa is good, but it is bad because it increases dependence by their own argument on world powers and is simply debt trap diplomacy. Gerstle 21 tells you that the Belt and Road Initiative uses loans that often come at commercial interest rates. It also leaves many with unsustainable debt. For example, China is funding a high-speed rail line in Laos that will cost equivalent to half the country's GDP. BRI loan terms are notoriously opaque and can burden countries with high debt. That's because, again, the United States is competing with China in Africa, which means they are simply using Africa as a battleground to enhance their own self-interest. So at the end of the day, they're not actually going to be lifting people out of poverty. They're not going to actually be helping the country or the countries they're in. They're just simply trapping them with debt, extracting all of their natural resources, using them, and then will leave. Thus, Dana and I are very proud to negate.
Then let's begin. Starting on our first argument about sea cables, they say there's always an incentive to develop these. However, our evidence is incredibly specific and literally mentions great power competition and says that after China was rejected for one of their cable plans, the US stepped in. It's incredibly specific. It's caused directly because of great power competition. But second, they say it contradicts. No, it doesn't. Our first argument is about developing sea cables, and the second argument is about deterrence. Completely different. Then on their impact, they say that it's not specific. It still applies because our sea cables that we develop are all across the globe, including in the DRC, which means that it's still part of the impact. Sea cables impact is obviously global. Then on South China Sea, they tell you themselves, China always has an incentive to invade and try to meddle in the South China Sea. That's critical because if they tell you that they always want to invade themselves, if we are not there to deter, that is a green light and they have no consequences for invading, which is why we need to deter. Then they say our impact is bad. Well, it's only a prediction because it hasn't happened yet because of great power competition. It's simply evaluating what would happen if oil prices did increase because of conflict in the South China Sea, which obviously hasn't happened because GPC works. Then on African investment, they just tell you about debt trapping. Two responses. First of all, the example that they cite, sure, it's a lot of money to be in debt in, but ultimately the high-speed rail, the reason why Laos agreed to put it in place anyways is because in the long term, the benefits way off. But second of all, this is exactly why we advocate for GPC, because GPC means that China is forced to compete with the US to offer the best option for Africa. Otherwise, Africa just turns to the other country. That's exactly our case's argument. That is why GPC solves on their case. Their first argument is about pandemics. They cite the example of 2017 coronavirus. Two issues. First of all, we would say that it was a lot easier to contain because it never spread outside of China. It's correlation, not causation. And second of all, the strain that they did was not specifically coronavirus that broke out in 2019, but it was actually SARS coronavirus 1, which is less transmissible and less contagious than the one that recently broke out. The uniqueness is terrible. But then, a couple of other responses. We would say that there's two realms of cooperation, political and scientific. First, starting off with political, just because we don't have great power competition anymore doesn't mean that we automatically get along politically. Things like scapegoating and xenophobia, which are the major reasons why we didn't cooperate with China during the recent pandemic, would still exist in either world. It's not like we're just like, oh, we're like friends now. But also, on the scientific aspect, scientific cooperation is outside of the political realm, which is why during the COVID pandemic, we did see scientific cooperation. We saw mass data sharing, which is why Mitchell 22 states that despite difficult relations and competition, collaboration remained resilient with almost 5% of the research published between US and Chinese scientists. But then finally, moving on to their next contention about Iran, we would say that, first of all, the US is not turning a blind eye on Iran. As recently as 2022, we've been working towards denuclearization, military development, and like removing their military capacity. But second of all, I would say you can turn this argument because Russia backs Iran. So as long as our GPC focuses on Russia, Iran like obviously falls under that umbrella. But third of all, we would say that Iran has been emboldened for decades. We don't know why this is the triggering point. Fourth, we would say that The US military is really big. They don't have to like focus on only two powers. We can still tell if they do something suspicious. And finally, the US supplies so much aid to Israel. We literally have a permanent military base there. So even if we aren't paying attention to Iran, we are paying attention to Israel. They're still protected, no chance of conflict. Then on lethal autonomous weapons, big turn. Lethal autonomous weapons are really, really good because they're more precise, which means that CFR states that there's less human collateral, which is on net benefit because even if we do have conflict, it's killing less people overall. But also, we would say that there's always going to be an incentive to develop these weapons because they're cheaper, need less troops, and have less overhead investment, which is why China and Russia are always going to develop it. And their link is specifically about cooperation, decreasing an arms race. No matter what, even if the US is not involved, there's still going to be an arms race. There's no uniqueness to this link. And finally, both their second two contentions rely on miscalculation. Miscalculation is super improbable because things like mutually assured destruction, which is why we haven't seen miscalculation happen in so many years.
Okay. So your second argument is about deterring China, right? And one of the main ways we're doing this is with cyber strikes.
I mean, that's one of the ways we're doing it.
Okay, so if you're advocating for increasing the amount of cyber strikes, wouldn't you argue against one of the biggest countries in the world? Wouldn't you argue that on net you're actually worsening cables and maybe cable infrastructure globally?
Just because you do a cyber attack doesn't mean it's on sea cable specifically.
Well,
They're two
I mean-
completely different topics.
isn't your first argument that we're super dependent on these sea cables, which is why they're a prime target? So logically, wouldn't we probably launch these cyber attacks on them?
I mean, I wouldn't say so because we've launched cyber attacks in other ways before. But the second thing is that our first
Then what
argument
do
is about like innovations and new developments of sea cables. Just because we launch a cyber attack on a Chinese sea cable doesn't mean that necessarily impacts the overall cable system as a whole, because we would say that the US still has large control over the majority. Can I take a question?
Yeah.
Okay, so on this argument about pandemics, right? So when we have like this type of cooperation, we need scientific cooperation, correct?
Yes.
So in that case, why do we need to get along like politically and stop competing militarily in order to have scientific cooperation?
Well, we would argue that like the political and scientific sphere are pretty merged. Like it's not like it's two separate spheres.
But why?
I mean, like if you're also also a lot of like the funding that was done for vaccines was government backed. So if the government is backing these projects, they're not gonna want to back people, especially if they're gonna compete. So the United States is competing with China, right? So if the government is backing a lot of these projects, they're not going to want to back projects that are collaborating with the enemy because it also benefits the enemy. That's why during COVID, China and the United States were developing vaccines separately, and China's vaccine was far worse than the United States's, which, I mean, by your point, we should have seen this. Their vaccine should have been great. Can I take a question?
I mean, but I would say that's not true insofar as our evidence finds that like they did do a lot of cooperation scientifically. But yeah, you can take a question.
Okay, perfect. Let's talk. Okay, let's talk more about your sea cables, right? So,
Yeah, sure.
where specifically has great power competition benefited these sea cables? Is Micronesia your example?
Like one specific example of was Micronesia, where the US filled in where China left, but we see that US has sea cables like across the entire world, and
Well,
largely
sure.
like even if it wasn't a specific trade-off, there's still the big competition between the market, because the overall narrative of like the sea cable industry in the US is that like, oh, China's sea cables are with like Huawei and they're like corrupt and authoritarian, so they're trying to combat those. It's still overall part of great power competition.
But you have to isolate the benefit. Okay.
All right. So first on pandemics, the first thing to talk about is how like it's easier to contain and it's correlation, not causation, SARS, not COVID. We offer you two things. We offer you number one examples and number two backed up factual sources. We offer you CRS, which specifically tells you that cooperation has decreased. They only talk about like government, they only talk about science sharing, but this is about government funding. Science sharing, scientists may share things, but the only way science really happens is the governments share money and funding and data. Scientists have nothing to do if the government does not fund this research, and that's what we show you. They also talk about political xenophobia. Political xenophobia existed at the time of SARS and in 2014 as well, when the US and China were able to cooperate to solve the prior diseases. So we can clearly see that this empirical example, they they claim that it's not true. They claim that it's correlation, not causation, but they don't offer a better counterexample of where the US and China were able to cooperate on COVID. Clearly, they didn't cooperate on COVID because China had a bad vaccine that didn't work, and they hid COVID from China and then a huge outbreak. Next, on Iran, they talk about how Russia backs Iran. The US treats them as separate actors. They also talk about denuclearization, but they miss the fact that Trump, who promoted GPC as the national security strategy, is the one who pulled us out of the Iran nuclear deal because he wanted to focus on other actors. Third, they say we supply aid for Israel, but it's about Israel's perception. If Israel thinks we don't protect them enough and we're not being hard enough on Iran, or like fighting against Iran or denuclearizing Iran, they're going to start an attack. And that's the crux of our contention, is that Israel's going to attack Iran because they feel like the US isn't defending them well enough. Now, third, on laws, this is where we win the round. This is extremely important. They say that laws are good because they're more precise, and this is shown because we haven't had miscalc, so MAD is going to solve anyway. This is the reason why they lose, because the reason we haven't had miscalculation in the many, many years of nuclear war is because humans are intervening. That's the entire reason we haven't had mutually assured destruction. Look at the closest we've ever gotten to nuclear Armageddon, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Why was the Cuban Missile Crisis not an example of miscalculation? Because hotlines existed and because humans got involved. That's why laws are so dangerous, because there's no opportunity for humans to communicate and de-escalate a scenario. What happens if China attacks the US, the lethal autonomous weapons attack back, and we're at war? Because everything is automated and everything is programmed. So it has no human de-escalation and the human element. That's why laws are so dangerous, and that's where evidence indicates they're being rushed into battle because of great power competition. They're being put in the South China Sea, and they're going to escalate the war and lead to a global nuclear war, which outweighs all of their impacts in this round. Now, first on undersea cables, we flow through our turn here about cyber attacks. They talk about how important undersea cables are to the world, and their impact is about how important these undersea cables are to the global economy and the global infrastructure sphere. But what they're advocating for is cyber attacks on China. China controls many of these undersea cables because they're a large actor in the tech sphere. If these undersea cables are so important, clearly they would be a prime target for attack. So if they're encouraging cyber attacks as part of GPC, this turns their argument because it's going to decrease job creation and hurt the economy. Second, on South China Sea, the US always deters China because we have a nuclear umbrella. The only way to cause them to go to war is an arms race, because Ryder 11 finds that an arms race increases the chance of war by 331%. And that's exactly what we're doing with lethal autonomous weapons and deterrence in the South China Sea. They claim it's deterrence, but in reality, it's an arms race because we're building up our arms, they're building up our arms. We can turn their argument and find that it would increase the price of food supplies, which is their impact. And finally, on Africa, clearly competition is not working if African countries are taking bad deals from China, bad debt traps. That's
okay. I'm going to start on our case and just go down the arguments, and then weighing, and then their case. Starting on naval security, their only response is that cables increase the number of attacks. No, we're talking about safeguarding critical data on cables. This is purely defensive. This is not going to cause any sort of like aggression or posturing between US and China and Russia. But and then on our South China Sea argument, they say it contradicts because GPC increases the number of cyber attacks. No, we're talking about the stuff that we're going to do in the South China Sea is purely defensive. It's all in terms of deterrence. If China attacks first, it's just that we're going to be ready. And second, they say that an arms race is going to occur. Their evidence here is really, really bad. It's just talks about like a 0.001% like increase. But then the most important argument in this round is our contention of African investment. We tell you that China is using African investment as a living testament of their great power status, which is why they've been their largest trading partner for 12 years. And great power competition is starting to change that in two ways. First, because it started to improve norms due to competition in the market, because now it's a race to the top. China has an incentive to better their norms because now they have another competitor in the market. But second, it also increases investment in Africa, as now there's money flowing from both US and China, and that's why we've seen a lot of economic growth and decreases in poverty by 4.5%. Their only response is them extending straight through ink this debt trapping response. We tell you that US-China competition is bettering norms, which means that China doesn't have the incentive to debt trap if they know that these African enterprises can just turn to the US in order to like make a profit instead. But then let's go on to weighing. There's a couple reasons why this African investment arg is winning the round. First is on probability, because we definitely know that competition in Africa is working in the status quo, but you have no idea at what brink their arguments were going to trigger, even though we've been doing great power competition for numerous years. In order to vote for any of their arguments, there's a lot of hurdles you have to jump over. You have to ask yourself, when will their impacts materialize? Are their impacts really that probable, etc.? But also, our argument is the only one providing long-term solvency. As competition increases between US and China, more countries are likely to get involved as Africa becomes a booming market which means our impact is going to constantly cyclically get better as time goes on. But then let's go on to their arguments. They really spread themselves thin by going for all three of their arguments and they don't respond to all of the responses we put on them. First, on pandemics, remember that countries separate political competition and scientific competition. They just say that China had a really bad vaccine, so that means that there was no collaboration. No, the US literally did research with China. Like 5% of research papers during COVID-19 were between the two countries, and US made it so like Pfizer and Moderna, etc., were accessible to China and also all other countries. But then let's look at Iran. They completely dropped this turn we put on here where we say that Russia literally backs Iran, which means that as long as great power competition occurs, we're always going to have more of a stronghold over Russia and thus all of its allies, including Iran, which means in our world, we're more likely in stopping this Iranian conflict. But finally, on lethal autonomous weapons, countries are always going to be in an inherent arms race with each other. The difference is, would you rather be dealing with unpredictable weapons or really precise weapons like lethal autonomous weapons? They can't give you a single example of them actually being used. There's really, really no bring here. There's so many hurdles you have to jump over to vote here. That's why we affirm.
All right. May I have
Yeah.
the first question?
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay. So if we have great power competition right now, right? And China and the US are competing in Africa, why are African countries taking these like really bad deals from China where they're basically trapped in debt and have like really, really high interest rates? Like, how is this doing anything to help Africa with great power competition?
Two things. First of all, we would say that this example of like the high-speed rail in Laos was probably signed a little bit ago, but also we would say that overall the trajectory is positive in terms of the types of investments we're seeing. Like a couple of years ago, the BRI was incredibly predatory, but now we're seeing that overall the investments are getting better. And I would say that like the people in Laos aren't stupid. Like I'm pretty sure they know that the interest rates are high too, but overall, since this is any sort of economic stimulus, it's going to have an overall positive impact to jumpstart growth.
Yeah, but I mean, here's the thing, right? Like, it's not actually improving on anything we already have, right? If countries want high interest loans, they can just go to the World Bank, right? If in order to prove that GPC is beneficial for Africa, you have to prove that China's offering them better deals than anyone else, or better deals than China would without GPC, and that's just not the case.
Our evidence is
they're not
really
offering them better
explicit in
deals.
saying that the norms between China and the West in terms of how they're dealing with these African enterprises, there's so much less corruption and there's like so much less like predatory loaning, etc. Because it makes sense when you have multiple competitors in the market, each competitor wants to make it so that they have the best deal and that African governments are more likely to choose them in order to like gain a profit. So obviously you don't want to be making really bad deals
No,
with them.
but also like
Empirics
you're
back it
just
up.
like,
Don't back
China
it
and
up.
the US are still offering predatory loans, and this is just
yeah.
coming from
Okay,
people in
but
other
here's
square
the thing.
for Africa.
Like you try to cite
Would you like to
empirics.
talk-
I read your evidence, and it cites like one empiric. Sure, like there's still room to improve, but that's where the
No,
time frame
I mean,
analysis comes in, which indicates that over time, the amount of investment is going to increase and it's only going to get better
Oh.
as this competition becomes more frequent.
So it's going to go from really, really, really
Question.
predatory to just predatory. Oh, that's great. Okay, would you like a question?
That's just like not the argument, but yeah, I'll take a question.
Sure. So
We're
like
trying to-
what is the alternative to using lethal autonomous weapons? Like what kinds of weapons would we use?
Okay, I don't think you get the lethal autonomous weapons argument. I don't think you guys fully understand it. It's not just that great power competition leads to us developing these lethal autonomous weapons, is that they're being rushed into the battlefield. That's the Vincent evidence, which you guys have just conceded. The Vincent
When
evidence
have we
tells
seen lethal autonomous weapons creating a
They're
big
being
conflict?
deployed
Because
right
I've never
now.
really heard of that.
they're being
Well, that's
deployed.
what our evidence tells
We
you.
read that in Case. That evidence has just gone conceded. The Vincent evidence is fabulous. It tells you that these AI weapons are being developed, being deployed into the
The
South
reason
China Sea
why we're
right now.
deploying AI
true.
weapons is because they're more precise. Why else would we make them? Because we're trying to
Okay,
limit
look, Laura-
civilian damage. As technology
Okay.
increases, we're making it so that there's
Yes,
it's
so,
more
like,
in the
great
military.
Just to
competition.
like clarify,
I understand your
because-
argument. I understand your
Can we
argument. But
restore?
but
great
we
power-
understand your
I
argument
understand
too. So if
No,
I
no,
can
wait, I understand that AI is good in the long run. We understand that. However,
And in
our
abstract.
evidence indicates, hold on, you don't have any evidence of that. Our evidence indicates that in the short term, great power competition is rushing AI technologies to the battlefield before they're ready, which is increasing the chance, which is greatly increasing chance of miscalculation. That's our argument.
That's
we
false.
understand your argument.
Okay,
But thank you.
It'll briefly be on Iran, then lethal autonomous weapons, pandemics, then just their case, and then weighing at the bottom. Is everybody ready? Okay. On Iran, we're not going for it, but we didn't drop the turn. Daniel tells you in his summary that we treat Iran and Russia as different actors, which is why their turn doesn't matter. Go to lethal autonomous weapons. Like I said in Cross, they fundamentally misunderstand the argument. The argument isn't just that lethal autonomous weapons are developed because of great power competition. It's that the Vincent evidence and Bartlett evidence, which have gone conceded, tell you that they're being rushed prematurely into battle, which is greatly increasing the chance of both a conventional and a nuclear conflict that would spread out globally. All of that is conceded. They just read you evidence that, or they just argue that AI technology is good in the long run, but in the short term, because of great power competition, it's going to lead to a large-scale conflict. Go to pandemics. They say that we don't respond to the fact that there's a difference between political and science. Yes, we do. Like I told you in rebuttal, I said in Cross, and Daniel told you in summary, things like vaccine development have to be funded by the government, which is why the government will never fund projects where there's collaboration between China and the United States. That's what our evidence indicates. Moreover, we give you the empiric from COVID-19, where during COVID-19, vaccines were developed separately, which led to China having a far worse vaccine. All of that is conceded. We never conceded their argument. Moreover, we would argue that in the future, pandemics, because of factory farms, are going to be 100 times worse, which makes this collaboration all the more imperative. This collaboration, though, is completely barred because of great power competition. With that being said, let's go to their case. Start in Africa. Their argument is just fundamentally not true. They can make all the logical arguments they want, but insofar as the empirics completely disprove it, they have no argument. We read you the thing about Laos, that right now, despite their argument, countries in Africa are still continuously taking predatory loans because of great power competition, and because these countries are because the United States and China are just trying to use Africa for their resources, they have no interest in their actual well-being. But then on cables, they completely drop. They mishandle our responses here. A, by their cables argument, cables are super vital to the global order. B, by their next argument about the South China Sea, they're arguing that we're going to increase our cyber attacks. And as far as they themselves have told you that cables are really important, we would tell you that these attacks come in the form of these cables. But then weigh it. Both lethal autonomous weapons, because it'll be a global conflict, completely outweighs their Africa conflict. Also, the pandemic that will be globally is also it encapsulates Africa, and it will be far worse. Thus, we strongly urge a negative ballot.
Starting on our case with South China Sea, and then moving to Africa, and then lethal autonomous, and then finally pandemics. Okay, so if everybody is ready, time starts now. I don't even know why they're still trying to go for this turn or like whatever this argument is on cables, because they're fundamentally misunderstanding our argument. Remember, in Emma's summary, she tells you that the South China Sea argument is not about increasing cyber attacks, rather it's increasing cyber capabilities and conventional capabilities as deterrents. That's why the two don't contradict, because we're not attacking their sea cables, we're simply deterring. That's where they're confused. But onto our argument about African investment. Also, that turn is like not weight at all. The link isn't in Senate too. There's like no place in the round for it. Then on African investment, this argument is really simple. We are seeing that right now we're seeing better investments between competition in US and China in Africa. It is very logical. If there's two countries competing for power in Africa, obviously they have to one-up each other in a race to the top to try to give the best incentive for Africa to choose them. At the end of the day, they try to say, oh, empirics disprove, and then they give you a solid one empiric of Laos. That's where you always prefer our argument, because our argument shows that historically the trend is upwards, where these loans are getting less predatory, and they're always going to be increasing economic growth. Prefer our holistic evidence over their one example. And also the Laos Railway is a little bit different, because like we've been mentioning since rebuttal, on net Laos is still going to increase economic growth. Obviously the country knows there's interest rates, but overall they still choose it because there's economic growth. At that point, we can weigh on probability. This weighing has been conceded since summary. Remember, we are already seeing this investment increase. We have already seen a 4.5% decrease in poverty because of this investment. This is the surest thing you can vote off of in this round. All of their arguments are hypothetical future arguments. Then remember, as we go forward, this is a long-term argument, because the investment is only going to get better and better through competition, outweigh on long term. But then on their argument about lethal autonomous weapons, this argument, they don't explain how it leads to conflict, the terminal impact, how many people it impacts. And also they admit themselves that in the long run, lethal autonomous weapons are better because they're more precise and decrease casualties. Overall, the long run, we would say always outweighs the short run, because they can see that it does benefit. But on pandemics, remember, our evidence is really good. It literally shows that we did have cooperation and the vaccines were made available. Please affirm.
Good round, guys. Good round, good final.
Good round.
Thank you so much, judges. Thank you so much.